The market for first-person shooters on home consoles is so oversaturated these days, you can practically hear it groaning under its own weight whenever a new one gets released. But it's interesting to reflect on the fact that, while the first games in this genre as we think of it now appeared on personal computers, it's a format that took a while to perfect for consoles. Keyboard and mouse controls, which were always the standard for these games on PC, took a while for developers to confidently translate to the more compact layout of a controller. One of the first to capably prove that it could be done was Bungie's formidable Xbox exclusive, Halo. Naturally, amid a flurry of hype, that became a flagship title for Microsoft's console, thus decisively proving that first-person action games could become killer apps on consoles. And perhaps more importantly, it was the game you'd buy an Xbox to play. But while Microsoft was able to secure an iconic first-person shooter for their console brand fairly early on, their direct market competitor at the time, Sony, never quite managed the same trick for their contemporary hardware. The PlayStation 2 would receive plenty of enjoyable games that were similar in premise, but it never managed to generate a franchise as memorable and instantly identifiable. And even when the console was succeeded by the PlayStation 3, it was still widely considered that the brand had yet to play host to a credible rival to Microsoft's Titanic property. That didn't stop Sony from trying though, and somewhere along the line in the search for a PlayStation exclusive Halo killer, they commissioned Insomniac Games to develop Resistance: Fall of Man, the first game in a series that would perhaps never scale the same heights as Bungie's masterpiece, but arguably had enough personality of its own that it never really needed to. Whether Resistance: Fall of Man was directly intended as an answer to Halo or not, I've got to confess I can't really say with authority. Sony certainly did push the series though, with no less than 3 core titles appearing on the PS3, as well as spin-offs on the PSP and Vita handhelds, and it's most definitely a game that deserves to be judged on its own respective merits, because I've seen a fair few bad Halo knockoffs on different consoles, and this isn't one of them. It definitely sets out to be its own game, and it's served well for that. I play a lot of first-person shooters, and I tend to think that the best ones are those that have a unique sense of identity. It's a tough genre to break new ground in, and these games really need to do something special to stand out from the crowd. Something like Resistance carries a certain extra weight of expectation on its shoulders as well, because not only is it a console exclusive, but this was a launch title for Sony's PlayStation 3. There would have been a natural expectation that it would showcase the console's capabilities. I should mention that the entire Resistance series somehow managed to pass me by on release. I didn't actually buy a PS3 until late in the system's lifespan, so having missed Fall of Man's initial 2007 release, it wasn't really on my radar in a big enough way for me to pay much attention to it. Or the sequels, which I also missed. In fact, I didn't even pick these games up until somebody suggested I should cover them on the show. And now that I've given the first of them a full playthrough, I don't know if it's necessarily a game I'd have considered I needed to own a PS3 for, but it's definitely enjoyable and it's got a lot going for it. For a start, the setting is interesting. I always enjoy a bit of genre mashing in my entertainment, and Resistance does this pretty boldly. What you've basically got here is a Call of Duty game set in 1940s wartime Britain, where the Allied forces are pitted against alien invaders. At least, I think they're aliens. The campaign's storyline isn't actually clear on who or what you're fighting. In fact, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that, although I've seen this game's story praised quite a bit since it first came out, it's really not that great. The whys and wherefores of its entire premise aren't really addressed clearly enough, and it's peppered with heavy-handed clichés. But then, this isn't really a game to play for its story. The plot, such as it is only there to provide a framework for the action, and in that respect, it's perfectly serviceable. It doesn't get in the way. And that's a good thing, because Resistance does action really well, and it's not afraid to kick your backside either. Resistance is a challenging game. When I play games for purposes of review on this show, I usually do it on their normal difficulty setting, and even then, this one puts up a pretty good fight. Some of the game design choices in play here ensure it's not something you'll breeze through. For example, where a lot of modern first-person shooters grant you automatically recharging health, this one doesn't. Instead, you have a segmented health bar that refills over time, but only as far as the last section of it that hasn't been fully depleted. I like that, because it adds that extra element of tension that a lot of shooters just don't have anymore. Keeping an eye out for health packs and remembering where you last saw one becomes really important as you chew through the campaign, and not having the option of retreating and hiding from a firefight until you're fully healed means that you have to approach them a bit more thoughtfully and cautiously at times. Thankfully though, it's not so hard that you ever feel like progress is impossible, but there are a few things that hold this first Resistance game back from being truly great, in my opinion. Although it's a tough game and pulls a few sneaky tricks to keep you on your toes, like dropping enemies right behind you in some stages and giving them guns that can shoot through walls, those enemies aren't blessed with especially great AI. Most are basically locked into their default modes of scripted behaviour, so at times progress feels like a matter of old school memorisation skills. Those aliens or mutants or whatever they are certainly never waver from their commitment to turn you into a smear on the landscape. They'll sometimes chase after you and delight in destroying anything you take cover behind, but once you've learned where they're going to attack from and which ones are likely to charge after you if you enter their line of sight, the otherwise exciting firefights lose a little of their magic. This only really occurs to me as a point of criticism because the combat in Resistance is so good otherwise. Like a lot of these games, enemy encounters tend to be parcelled out in a structured fashion, so you've usually got some breathing space between them. But when you're caught right in the thick of it, there's an appreciable sense of being on the front lines against a relentless enemy. They don't muck around. Trading shots with them is often an exciting and sometimes frantic experience, so it hurts the game a little bit when you start to see your progress defined by learning set patterns of enemy behaviour. Some parts of the game that initially gave me trouble were quickly beaten when I'd worked out where new enemies would appear from or what order I had to take them out in, or where I needed to be on the map when a certain larger enemy showed up. And I just can't help but feel that, for this game in particular, that puts a dent in the sense of immersion. I'm not a huge fan of the way some of the environments are designed either. Very often, they encourage exploration, which usually sees you rewarded with a health pack or much needed ammo pickup. But every now and then, I found that the way forward through a stage wasn't as easy to find as I'd have liked, sometimes leading to the odd moment where I would wonder exactly where I was supposed to go. I appreciate that there's a fine line between guiding players through a game as opposed to leading them by the hand, but at times, mainly due to the samey colour tones of the visuals, the route I had to follow didn't become apparent until I'd done a bit of aimless wandering and backtracking. Some stages are also quite short, with at least a couple of them, including the first instance of my commandeering an enemy attack robot, which surely should have been a high point of the entire campaign, feeling like they were over before they'd begun, and that threw the campaign's pacing off kilter for me. There's still plenty of good stuff to make up for these rough edges and kinks in execution though. In its favour, Resistance is a pretty long game. I've kind of grown used to the idea nowadays that most first-person shooters can be completed within a few evenings of solid play. But what can I tell you? I certainly played Resistance solidly for an hour or two each evening, and it took me a couple of weeks to finish. That makes a nice change to the likes of certain shooters I could mention that struggle to manage a 6-hour campaign. Beating the game for the first time unlocks new weapons to use in a second playthrough as well, so there's certainly some replay value here. But the best recommendation I can make of Resistance is that, basically, everything you need from a good first-person shooter is here, and effort's being made to make sure it doesn't feel interchangeable with the next one on your shelf. The alternate history sci-fi setting gives Insomniac all the license they need to put a range of interesting weapons in your hands, from the stock rifles, shotguns and rocket launchers you'd expect, to crazier and more destructive weapons pilfered from the probably alien claws of your enemy. These include guns that shoot round corners, guns that create destructible barriers of goop, guns that shoot through walls, and guns that just make things go boom much louder than your standard weedy human sidearms, which, by the way, is never going out of style. Each has an alternate fire mode, sometimes drastically altering the functionality of the weapon in hand, and that keeps gameplay varied and fun. The same can be said of the different types of enemy you will encounter. You'll quickly get used to the sight of enemy grunts, who fire back at you enough that you could never accuse them of being simple bullet sponges, but there are plenty of interesting variations on their basic design, including agile wall-crawling types, hulking giants, and tiny ones that appear in screaming swarms with the sole intent of turning your trousers brown. At certain points in the campaign, you'll also get to drive a few different vehicles. It's actually during these sections that the game reminds me most of the original Halo, to bring that comparison up again, because the way these parts of the game are implemented feels very similar. Except, I'd argue that Resistance does them better. In the first Halo, I always felt like I was fighting the controls for its vehicles, but here, whether you're climbing into a jeep, a tank, or a walking alien death machine, everything handles smoothly, and with an appropriate sense of weight. So, like I say, there's lots of good stuff here. The only aspect of Fall of Man's campaign that I found truly disappointing was that, as it wears on, the variety seen in the weapons, different enemy types, and even the way the campaign itself is structured isn't quite matched by its visual design. It's a game that takes you to some interesting places, and later stages do manage to evoke an eerie, otherworldly feel as you push deeper into enemy territory. But these environments just don't look very interesting to my eyes, and I think that's a shame. Because, remembering that this is a console exclusive, I would have liked it if Insomniac had capitalised on Fall of Man's excellent premise by drawing on the power of the PS3 to show me something more alien and out there. Instead, well, it's not a bad looking game, but I do wonder if somebody in the art department was on a mission to show the world how many shades of grey and brown the console could render. Looking back at it from the vantage of the present, I think Resistance Fall of Man shows its age a little more noticeably than some shooters on the PS3. Its drab visuals, even though they're in keeping with the game's setting, meant it didn't really grab my attention from the off when I first started playing. But this game's a slow burner, holding its best moments back until you're a little way in, and once it hits its stride, it's a lot of fun. All that's lacking is maybe an extra layer of polish. I do wonder if the obvious intent to expand Resistance into a franchise from the outset makes this first game in the series a less interesting single-player experience than it could have been. By the end of my first playthrough, I was still sketchy on some of the finer points of the story, and I found myself wishing the campaign could have explained itself better and maybe taken me to more fantastical places than it eventually did. But those are very personal criticisms. The fact is, Resistance trumps up the goods where it counts. It plays well, its campaign is refreshingly long-lived, and it offers up a decent challenge. There may be a few points of its execution that I wish were a bit slicker, but the combination of all the things it does right makes it a creditable early entry in the PS3 software catalogue, and it's a very respectable console shooter in its own right.